I am recording this on a Tuesday because by Friday it might be too late. If you are hearing my voice, then something has already happened, or something is about to. I don't know which is worse. I've thought about that question for the better part of a week now, sitting in my truck with the engine off and the heater on, watching my breath fog the windshield, and I still don't have an answer. Maybe there isn't one. My name is Dominic Reeves. I am 46 years old. I am a contracted security operator currently assigned to Alfred Regional Airfield, a decommissioned airport in rural Augusta County, Virginia. I've been at this post for just over 3 months. The contract is open-ended. The pay is more than I've ever made in my life. And every Friday morning at exactly 2:17 a.m. a plane lands on a runway that hasn't seen legitimate traffic since 1987. The plane is a Douglas DC-8, Pan American livery, registration N914 Pascals. It originally took off from Newark on the 12th of March, 1971, bound for Richmond. It carried 42 passengers and 5 crew. It never arrived. It still hasn't. But it lands at Alfred every week. It has been landing every week, near as anyone can tell, for over 50 years. And I've been told, in writing with signatures and witnesses and a federal NDA stapled to the back of a contract thicker than a Bible, that I am never to speak of it, not to my family, not to a journalist, not to a priest, not to a priest, not to anyone. I am speaking now. I am speaking because I need someone to know, not to save me. I don't think that is possible anymore, but to know, because if I don't make it past this Friday, then the only honest record of what happens at that airport will be filed by the people who built the cage. And they're not honest. They're not even close. So here it is. The whole thing, start to finish. Every rule I followed, every rule I broke, every face I saw through the glass that I will see again in my dreams for whatever's left of my life. To understand why I am recording this, you need to understand how I got here. And to understand that, you need to know what kind of man takes a job guarding an airport where nothing is supposed to fly. Before I get into the story, I want you to know what kind of state I am in, because it'll matter when you decide whether to believe me. I haven't slept more than 3 hours at a stretch in 26 days. I keep a notebook by the bed and another in the truck and a third in my back pocket, because my short-term memory has started doing strange things. Losing minutes, mostly, sometimes losing whole conversations. I'll be standing in the kitchen with the kettle whistling and not remember turning the burner on. I'll find my keys in the freezer. Yesterday I found my badge in the medicine cabinet, sitting on top of the aspirin bottle like I'd left it there on purpose. There are marks on my forearms. 2 of them on the left arm, 3 on the right. They're shaped like fingerprints. Not pressed in, pressed out, if that makes sense. Like someone touched me from the inside. They don't hurt. They don't fade. I had a doctor look at them last week, and he said they weren't bruises, weren't burns, weren't any kind of dermatological condition he recognized. He asked me, very gently, if I'd been under a lot of stress. I said yes. He prescribed me something to help me sleep. I haven't taken it. I am afraid to be unconscious. There is a smell that follows me now. Jet fuel, which makes a certain amount of sense given where I work. But underneath the jet fuel there is something else, something floral, gardenias, specifically. I had to look it up because I am not the kind of man who knows flowers by name. My ex-wife used to grow them on the porch of the house we lost. The smell is on my clothes. It is in my truck. My landlord asked me last week if I'd started wearing cologne. I told him no. He looked at me a little too long. The passengers are changing. That is the part I keep coming back to. They are not what they were when I started, and they are getting closer every Friday to whatever it is they're becoming. One of them spoke to me last week. She knew my name. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me start where the contract started. Let me tell you about Alfred. Before I do, I want to make you a promise. I am going to tell you everything in the order it happened. I am not going to dramatize. I am not going to embellish. I've spent 22 years in security work, 18 of them legitimate, 4 of them since the firing. And one thing I learned early is that a clean report is the only kind worth writing. If I tell you something happened, It happened. If I tell you I saw something, I saw it. Where I am not sure, I'll say I am not sure. Where I am guessing, I'll tell you it is a guess. I am going to describe exactly what I was told, exactly what I read, exactly what I observed, and exactly what I now believe is the truth. The truth is the worst part. I want you to be ready for it before you get there, because I wasn't. By the end of this recording, you will understand why I can't simply quit. You'll understand why driving away isn't an option, why filing a police report isn't an option, why hiring a lawyer isn't an option. The contract addressed all of that. Page 47, paragraph 14. Subsection C. I read the words a dozen times before I signed. I told myself it was boilerplate. I told myself nobody actually enforces clauses like that. I was wrong. They enforce them. They've enforced them before. There are men whose names used to appear on payroll at Threshold Infrastructure Group, who do not appear anywhere now. Not on tax records, not on social media, not on gravestones. I've checked 3 of them, by name. They're gone in a way that people don't simply go. So I am not running. There is nowhere to run to. What I am doing instead is leaving a record. If something happens to me, somebody will find this file. Maybe my daughter eventually, when she is older and starts asking questions. Maybe a stranger, maybe nobody. But it'll exist. And the existence of it is the only thing I can give back to the people who never got to leave a record of their own. It started with a job listing on a private security board. No company name, no location, just a pay rate that made me refresh the page 3 times. I found the posting on a board called SentinelNet, a vetted invitation-only listing service for private security contractors. You don't get on SentinelNet without references, a clean federal background check, and at least a decade in the field. I'd been on it since 2014. I checked it twice a day after the firing because mainstream job sites had stopped returning my calls. The listing was 4 lines long. Solo overnight position, decommissioned federal airfield, Mid-Atlantic region, $9,200 a month, paid weekly. NDA with federal penalty clauses. Must pass psychological screening. Apply within. No company name, no address, no phone number, just a contact form, and $9,200 a month for overnight security at an empty airport. That was triple what I'd made at my last legitimate job and 4 times what unemployment had been paying me. I read it 3 times to make sure I hadn't misplaced a decimal. The requirements were where it got strange. The first was standard, clean background, no felonies, valid concealed carry. The second was unusual, no active family dependents, not preferred, required. I read that one twice too. The third was the psychological screening, and the fourth was the NDA with federal penalty clauses, which is language you don't see on a normal civilian listing. I should have closed the tab. I knew, even then, that a job description that specifically excludes people with families is a job description, written by someone who doesn't want anyone asking where you've gone. I'd worked enough adjacent contracts in my career to recognize the silhouette of that particular kind of opportunity. But I was 4 months behind on rent. My truck was making a sound I couldn't afford to diagnose. My ex-wife had stopped responding to my texts about Lily, and the last court letter I'd received used the phrase, supervised visitation pending stability assessment. I didn't have stability. I didn't have anything. I had a SentinelNet account and a savings balance of $211. I clicked apply. I passed the screening. I don't know how. Maybe that should have been my first warning. The interview was conducted in a leased office on the 3rd floor of a building in Charlottesville that didn't have any signage in the lobby directory. The office itself was furnished but lifeless. A desk, 2 chairs, a single framed print of a coastline I couldn't place. No computer, no filing cabinet, no nameplate on the door. The woman who interviewed me introduced herself as Marion Caldwell. She was in her mid-50s, silver hair cut into something practical, a charcoal blazer that fit her the way clothes fit people who have them tailored. She shook my hand once firmly and gestured me into the chair across from hers. She represented an organization called the Threshold Infrastructure Group, TIG, She said it like it was a brand I should already recognize. I didn't. She didn't blink at a normal rate. I noticed it within the first minute. Most people blink 15-20 times a minute. It is automatic. You don't think about it. Marion blinked maybe 4 times in our first 10 minutes of conversation. Always at the start of a sentence, always once. Like punctuation, she asked me about my last position. I told her about the wrongful termination, the lawsuit I couldn't afford to pursue, the 18 months of clean service before the manufactured incident that ended my career. She listened. She didn't take notes. She asked me about my divorce. She asked me about my daughter. She asked me twice whether I had anyone who would notice if I changed my contact patterns for a few weeks at a time. I told her my mother was dead. My father didn't speak to me. My sister lived in Oregon, and we exchanged Christmas cards. I told her my ex-wife had primary custody of my daughter, and we communicated through a parenting app. I told her, basically, that nobody was going to file a missing persons report if I went quiet. She wrote that down. The only thing she wrote down, then she explained the job. Overnight security at Alfred Regional Airfield. Sunday through Thursday plus Friday elevated protocol. Patrols, perimeter checks, incident logging, equipment maintenance. Standard duties for a closed facility. The Friday elevated protocol, she said, would be explained during orientation. After I signed, I asked what kind of incidents I should expect. She said, whatever kind of incidents you observe. She handed me a binder. 86 pages. She said I could ask questions after I read it. I wish I'd never opened it. The binder was unmarked on the cover, black vinyl, 3 rings, a laminated index tab system inside. The first 6 sections read like any facility security manual I'd ever seen. Perimeter protocol. Access logs, communication chain. Incident report formatting. Use of force escalation, emergency contact procedures. It was thorough, professional, and entirely unremarkable. I almost let myself relax. Then I got to Section 7. Section 7 was titled, in plain Times New Roman, Friday Protocol, Runway 7 Event Procedures. It was 31 rules long. It used the same dry institutional language as the rest of the binder, numbered, lettered subsections, references to other rule sets. But the content was something I had never seen in a security manual in my life. Rule 1. Begin Friday protocol at 2 a.m. Position in observation booth. No later than 2:10 a.m. Rule 2. Activate all recording equipment before 2:14 a.m. Do not rely on digital timestamps. Use the analog clock provided. Rule 3. Do not approach within 40 meters of the aircraft during the event window, defined as 2:17 a.m. through 3:03 a.m. I stopped reading. I went back to the top of the section. I read Rule 3 again. There was no aircraft listed anywhere else in the binder. No flight schedule, no tower frequency, no taxi lanes referenced. The airport had been decommissioned for 37 years. I kept reading. Rule 4. Do not make direct visual contact with passengers through cabin windows using unaided eyes. Optics and cameras are acceptable. Rule 5. Do not respond to any auditory communication originating from the aircraft or its vicinity. Rule 7. If knocking occurs on any surface of the observation booth, do not acknowledge it verbally or physically. Log the time, duration, and perceived origin point. Rule 9. Do not bring personal photographs, identifying documents, or personal electronics into the observation booth. Rule 12. In the event of passenger egress from the aircraft, activate the Protocol 12 emergency beacon and remain sealed in the booth. Do not exit for any reason. Rule 14. If a passenger addresses you by name, report immediately. Do not respond. Do not confirm your identity. I closed the binder. I sat for a long time looking at the laminated index tabs. I thought about handing it back. I thought about walking out, taking the elevator down to the lobby, getting in my truck, and driving home. I thought about my daughter's face in the photo on my dashboard. I thought about my savings balance. I opened the binder again. I asked Marion what happens if someone breaks the rules. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "The previous contractor broke Rule 4. We found his truck. We never found him. Alford Regional Airfield sits on 200 acres of Virginia pine forest, 12 miles from the nearest town, at the end of a state-maintained road that ends at a TIG-installed gate. The airport was decommissioned in 1987, when commercial regional service consolidated and the FAA pulled the controlled airspace designation. The terminal building is a 2-story brick structure from the early 60s, boarded up at every entrance, the windows covered in plywood that has been replaced recently, within the last 2 or 3 years, based on the lack of weathering. There is a control tower that hasn't been operational since the 80s. There are 2 hangars, both padlocked, both with TIG security seals on the doors. There is a fuel depot that has been drained and decommissioned. There is a small administrative outbuilding that serves as my shift station, and there are 2 runways. Runway 1, which is cracked and overgrown and unusable, and Runway 7, which is also cracked and overgrown, except for one specific 400-meter stretch in the middle. That stretch is maintained. I noticed it on my first walk through. During the daylight orientation Louis Tran ran for me. The asphalt was clean. The runway lighting in that section was operational, wired into a generator behind the maintenance shed. Someone was mowing the grass on either side of it, keeping it short and clear. Someone was repainting the centerline stripes. Someone was very carefully keeping just enough of this dead airport alive to receive an aircraft. I asked Louis who handled the runway maintenance. He said he did. I asked him why. He said, "It is in the contract." The observation booth sits 80 meters from the maintained section of Runway 7, at a 45-degree angle from the centerline. It is a reinforced concrete structure, roughly the size of a 1-car garage, with armored glass windows on 3 sides, and a single steel door on the 4th. The interior contains a desk, a chair, a bank of monitors, 2 recording stations, an analog wall clock, a coffee machine, a small refrigerator, and a sealed equipment locker. There is no bed. There is no bathroom. The booth is not designed for someone to stay in for long. The first 4 shifts were Monday through Thursday. Nothing happened. I patrolled the perimeter. I checked the gates. I logged my entries. I drank bad coffee and watched the deer cross the runway in the moonlight. I almost convinced myself the Friday protocol was some kind of elaborate hazing. A test for new contractors, a way to weed out the imaginative ones. Then Friday came. I started Friday protocol at 2 a.m. exactly, the way the binder said. I was in the observation booth by 2:08. I activated the recording equipment by 2:11. I checked the analog clock against my wristwatch and noted, in the log, that they were synchronized. I sat down. I waited. The booth at night is a strange place. The fluorescent overhead lights are too bright. They buzz at a frequency that gets inside your teeth. After about an hour, the monitors emit a low hum. Outside, beyond the armored glass, the runway sits in the soft amber wash of the centerline lights, and beyond the runway, the pine forest is a black wall under a black sky. You can see a long way at Alford because there is nothing taller than a tree for miles in any direction. You can see the stars in a way you forget is possible until you are somewhere with no light pollution. At 2:14, I noted in the log that all systems were functional. The cameras were recording. The directional microphones were live. The thermal imaging was active. The Protocol 12 beacon was armed. At 2:14 and 40 seconds, the temperature inside the booth dropped. I noticed it on the wall thermometer, first 68 degrees, then 65, then 61. The HVAC was set to 70. I checked the digital readout on the climate panel. It showed the system was running normally, attempting to compensate. The temperature kept falling. 59, 57, 56. At 2:15 and 30 seconds, the temperature stabilized at 57 degrees, 11 degrees below where it had been 90 seconds earlier. Outside, on the tarmac thermometer, the ambient temperature had dropped the same amount. Then I heard it. It came from the east, high up, the unmistakable sound of a propeller-driven aircraft engine, deep and steady, the kind of sound you don't really hear anymore unless you live near a small private airfield or an air show. Except Alford wasn't under any active flight path. The nearest controlled airspace was 40 miles north. There were no scheduled regional flights at 2:15 a.m. on a Friday morning. I checked anyway on the FAA app on the booth's hardline tablet. The sky over Alfred was empty. The sound got louder. I looked up through the booth's overhead viewing port. I couldn't see anything yet, just the black sky, the impossible carpet of stars. But the engines were close now. 2 engines, then 4. A 4-engine propliner descending. Then I saw it. And I understood why the pay was $9,200 a month. It came in low over the eastern tree line, banking gently to a line with runway 7. Its landing lights were on, 3 of them, 2 on the wings and 1 beneath the nose. Bright enough that I could see them clearly against the black sky, bright enough that they cast moving shadows across the tarmac as the aircraft descended. It was a Douglas DC-8. I knew it before I saw the registration number, because the silhouette is unmistakable to anyone who grew up around aviation. Long, narrow fuselage, 4 engines mounted on underwing pylons, that distinctive nose. The fuselage was painted in the classic Pan American livery, white upper, polished aluminum lower, the blue cheat line running the length of the body, the globe logo on the tail. As it banked, I read the registration number in white block lettering near the rear of the fuselage. November 914, Papa Alpha, N914 pascals. I had researched the manifest the night before when I couldn't sleep, when the binder had me too rattled to do anything but type questions into search engines. I knew that registration. I knew what it had been doing the last time anyone saw it. It descended at a perfect glide angle, 3 degrees, by the look of it, which is the standard approach angle for civilian commercial traffic. The pilot, and I have to call them a pilot because the inputs were too smooth, too professional for any kind of automated system, flared at exactly the right altitude, kissed the tarmac with the main gear first, settled the nose, and rolled out down the maintained 400-meter strip, with what I can only describe as textbook execution. The plane stopped roughly 250 meters from the booth. The fuselage was pristine. I want you to understand what that means. The DC-8 was first manufactured in 1958. By 1971, when N914 pascals disappeared, even a well-maintained airframe would have showed wear, paint oxidation along the leading edges, exhaust staining behind the engine pylons, the small dings and scuffs that accumulate on any working aircraft. This plane had none of that. Through the optics, I could see the rivets gleaming. I could see the fresh white paint. I could see on the side of the fuselage the original 1971 service decals, with ink that looked like it had been applied yesterday. The engines wound down. The propellers slowed and stopped. But the silence wasn't complete. There was a low hum that persisted deep enough that I felt it in my chest more than heard it, like standing next to a transformer station. It didn't come from the aircraft exactly. It came from around the aircraft, from the air itself. The protocol said to observe. Record: do not approach within 40 meters. Do not make direct visual contact with any passenger through the windows using unaided eyes. I followed every rule almost. The optics provided in the booth were military grade. A pair of stabilized observation binoculars on a tripod mount, with night vision overlay and infrared toggle. I'd been trained on similar equipment in a previous contract. I knew how to use them without thinking about it. I trained them on the cabin. The cabin windows of N914 pascals glowed with a warm amber interior light, the kind of light you see in old cabin photographs from the early 70s, the soft yellow of incandescent reading bulbs. Through the windows I could see seated figures, heads, shoulders, the upper portions of torsos. They were in their seats. They were not moving. 42 passengers, I counted them, twice, working my way from the front of the cabin to the rear window by window. The configuration matched what I'd researched. A single aisle layout with 2 seats on each side, 21 rows, the standard Pan Am domestic fit for a DC-8. Most rows had both seats occupied. A few had only one. The total came out to 42 the way it should have. Then I checked the cockpit. Through the small forward windows I could see the silhouettes of the flight crew, the captain in the left seat, the first officer in the right behind them, a third figure standing, the flight engineer, presumably. 2 flight attendants visible through the forward galley windows. 5 crew, 42 passengers, 47 figures total, identical to the manifest. None of them moved. I watched for a long time. I watched for the small involuntary movements that human beings make when they are sitting still. The rise and fall of breathing, the small adjustments of weight, the turn of a head, the lift of a hand. I watched for the things you don't notice when someone is moving normally but become impossible to miss when they aren't moving at all. Nothing. After about 4 minutes of complete stillness, I noticed something else. Not all of the heads were oriented forward. Most of them were. Most of the passengers were facing the seats in front of them, the way a passenger does on a flight. But 3 of them, scattered through the cabin, had their heads tilted at angles that no living person sustains comfortably. One head was tilted 90 degrees to the right, resting on the shoulder. One was tilted backward, far enough that the chin pointed at the ceiling. One was facing directly into the aisle, the cheek pressed against the seat back in front of it, the mouth visibly open. They weren't sleeping. People don't sleep at those angles. Mannequins do. For exactly 43 minutes, I watched them not move. At 3 a.m. exactly, the cabin lights went dark. At 3:01, the engines spooled up. That long, rising whine of 4 turboprops, coming back to life. At 3:03, Flight 914 taxied, accelerated, and took off into a sky that should have been empty. It climbed at a steep angle faster than a DC-8 should be able to, until I lost sight of it in the stars. My radar screen showed nothing. There was never anything on the radar. The post-event protocol called for a complete tarmac inspection within 15 minutes of departure. I waited the full 15 because the binder was very clear about it, and because frankly I needed every one of those minutes to convince my legs to stand up. I unsealed the booth at 3:18 a.m. I stepped out into air that smelled like aviation fuel and gardenias. I logged the smell. I didn't know what to make of it then. The runway lights were still on in the maintained section. I walked the 400 meters of tarmac with a high-output flashlight and a clipboard. I was looking for the things the binder said I might find: physical artifacts, foreign material, biological residue. The first thing I found were the tire marks. They were at the touchdown point, 2 parallel streaks of fresh black rubber on the tarmac, the kind of mark you get from a heavy aircraft landing under load. I touched one. The rubber was real. It was warm. It came off on my fingertip in a faint smudge of black powder. A real aircraft had landed on this runway, an aircraft heavy enough to leave rubber, an aircraft with tires. I kept walking. About midway down the strip near where the cabin door would have been, I found a single piece of paper. It was lying on the tarmac face up, weighted down by nothing, undisturbed by the wind. I crouched and looked at it without picking it up first, the way I'd been trained to do at any incident scene. It was a boarding pass. Pan American, the old design, the rounded corners, the carbon paper texture, the hand-stamped seat number. The flight number was 914. The date, printed in faded type, was the 12th of March, 1971. The seat assignment was 14C. The passenger name, in neat capital letters, was Margaret Hollowell. I bagged it. I logged it. I sealed the bag and placed it in the evidence locker exactly the way the binder said to. My hands were not steady. I noticed that, and I logged that too. I didn't sleep that weekend. I sat in my apartment with the lights on and the curtains closed, and I drank coffee, and I read the binder cover to cover 3 more times. I called Marion on Monday morning at the contact number I'd been given. She answered on the second ring. She didn't ask me how I was. She didn't ask me what I'd seen. She asked me one question. Did any of them look at you? I told her no. Not that I'd noticed, she said. Good, continue observation. Do not deviate from protocol. And she hung up. I sat in my truck with the phone in my hand, and I thought, for the first time, that I had been hired to feed something. The thing about a job like this, once you get past the first week, is how quickly the impossible becomes routine. That sounds like a confession of bad character, and maybe it is. But the human mind is built for repetition. You can stand in front of a horror movie one Friday, and a horror movie the next Friday, and a horror movie the Friday after that. And by the fourth Friday, you are no longer a man watching a horror movie. You are a man at work. By week 2, I had a routine. I'd arrive at Alfred by 9 p.m. on Thursday. I'd run the perimeter check. I'd settle into the booth. I'd eat dinner from a thermos at midnight. I'd start Friday protocol at 2 a.m. I'd watch the plane land. I'd watch the passengers not move. I'd watch the plane leave. I'd inspect the runway. I'd file the report. I'd go home. But I was watching closely. The binder rewards close watching, even when it punishes other things. And starting in week 2, I started seeing changes. Week 2, a passenger in row 8, left side window seat, was sitting at a slightly different angle than he had been the week before. In week 1, his head had been tilted forward, chin on chest. In week 2, his head was upright, facing the seat back in front of him. I checked my week 1 photographs. The shift was small but unambiguous. Week 3, the cockpit door was ajar. It had been closed in weeks 1 and 2. In week 3, it was open by perhaps 4 inches. I could see, through the gap, the silhouette of the flight engineer's right shoulder. Nothing else moved, just the door. Week 4, a passenger was standing. I noticed it almost immediately when I trained the optics on the cabin. Row 12, aisle. A man middle-aged based on the silhouette, dark suit, light shirt. He was on his feet, in the aisle, facing the rear of the aircraft. He did not move for the entire 43 minutes, but he was standing. I reported every deviation. I described them in detail. I attached time-stamped photographs. Marion's responses were always the same single sentence. Noted. Continue observation. Do not deviate from protocol. Week 5, the passenger in seat 14C was facing the window. In weeks 1 through 4, 14C had been facing forward, like most of the passengers. The body language had been neutral, indistinguishable from the rest. In week 5, the figure was turned almost 90 degrees to the right. The side of her head pressed lightly against the inside of the cabin window. Her face was turned outward. She was looking at the booth. She was looking at me. I reported it, Marion said. Noted. And then, after a pause that wasn't usually there, she added, continue observation. Do not establish eye contact through the optics. That was the first time her instructions had changed. I started looking into what she wasn't telling me. I had a laptop at home that I'd never connected to my work network, on Marion's instructions and my own common sense. I used it to do the research I should have done before I signed the contract. Pan American Regional Flight 914 departed Newark International at 8:48 p.m. on the 12th of March, 1971, bound for Richmond. Scheduled flight time of 1 hour and 12 minutes. Weather conditions at takeoff, clear, light winds, no advisories. 42 passengers, 5 crew. Captain James R. Ennis, with 22,000 hours including 6,000 on the DC-8 platform. First Officer Daniel Morales. Flight Engineer Wallace Chen. Flight attendants Helen Kowalski and Diane Pratt. The flight had taken off normally. It had been tracked on radar for 23 minutes, climbing to its assigned altitude of 15,000 feet, on course for Richmond. At 9:11 p.m., the tower at Washington Center had logged a routine check-in from Captain Ennis. At 9:13 p.m., 2 minutes later, the radar return for Flight 914 had vanished, not faded, not declined gradually. Vanished in a single sweep between one rotation of the radar and the next. There had been no distress call, no mayday, no engine fire warning, no mechanical fault detected by the onboard transponder. The aircraft simply ceased to exist. On radar, mid-flight, in clear weather, at 15,000 feet, over rural Virginia. The search had covered 400 square miles. It had lasted 6 weeks. It had recovered nothing. No wreckage, no debris field, no oil slick, no personal effects, not a single piece of metal that could be identified as belonging to N914 Pascals. The NTSB investigation had remained open until 1974. The final report listed the cause as unknown. The cause has been unknown for 55 years. The passenger manifest was partially public, released to the families during the 1972 lawsuit. I found a digitized copy in a regional newspaper archive. I scrolled through the names. Margaret Hollowell, seat 14C, 34 years old, school teacher from Baltimore, traveling to Richmond to visit her mother for the elder Hollowell's 65th birthday. She had been engaged to be married to a man named Thomas Reed, who in 1971 had been a junior associate at a Baltimore law firm. Thomas Reed had given an interview to the Baltimore Sunday in 1973, on the second anniversary of the disappearance. He had said he was still hoping for closure. The manifest gave me 47 names. The binder gave me 31 rules. Neither gave me the answer I needed. What happens when they finish changing? Louis Tran came to the airport every Wednesday at noon to perform maintenance on the booth equipment, the runway lighting, and the perimeter sensors. I'd met him on my first day when he ran my orientation walkthrough. He was a lean, quiet man in his late 40s, Vietnamese American, with the kind of careful hands that come from years of working on small mechanisms. He wore a TIG-issued coverall and steel-toed boots, and he carried his own toolkit, an old leather case with his initials embossed on the handle. For the first month, Louis and I exchanged maybe 100 words total. He'd nod at me when he arrived, do his work, sign the maintenance log, and leave. I respected the silence. Solo overnight contractors learn quickly not to push small talk on people who haven't offered any. In week 5 after the Margaret incident, I started staying late on Wednesdays. I told myself it was to handle paperwork. It wasn't. I wanted to talk to Louis. It took 3 Wednesdays to get him to talk. The first Wednesday, I asked him how long he'd been at Alford. He said 3 years. The second Wednesday, I asked him if he'd seen many contractors come and go. He said yes. I asked how many. He said, "You are the 4th. The third Wednesday, I brought coffee. I made it the way Louis took it. Black, no sugar, based on having watched him drink from his thermos for 10 weeks. I left a cup on the maintenance bench when he wasn't looking. He drank it. He didn't say thank you, but when he finished his work, he sat down across from me at the booth small desk, and he said, "What do you want to know?" I asked what happened to the other 3. He said the first one quit 2 weeks in. He drove off in the middle of a Wednesday and never came back. Tig sent people after him. I don't know what happened. He is not on payroll anymore. He is not anywhere. I asked about the second one. Louis said, the second one was a woman. She lasted 7 months. She was good, smart. She figured out things you haven't figured out yet. Then one Friday she didn't come back from the booth after the event. She was in the booth at 3:03. By 4 o'clock she was gone. The booth door was still locked from the inside. Her truck was still in the lot. They never found her either. I asked about the third. Louis went quiet for a long time. Then he said, his name was Garrett Sable. He answered when they knocked. Week 7. The landing happened on schedule. The plane touched down at 2017, taxied to its usual stopping point. Sat there with the warm amber cabin lights glowing through the windows. I logged the variations. Passenger in row 5 had shifted. Cockpit door was open 6 inches now. 2 passengers were standing, and I settled in for the remaining 38 minutes of the event window. At 2:47 a.m. exactly, someone knocked on the booth door. 3 knocks. Evenly spaced, polite. The way a neighbor knocks when they've come to ask if they can borrow a tool. Knock, knock, knock. A pause of about 2 seconds. Then again knock, knock. Knock. The booth was 80 meters from the aircraft. No one had exited. I'd been watching the cabin door the entire time through the optics. It hadn't opened. Nobody had come down a slide, a ladder, a ramp. Anything. I had thermal imaging on the tarmac. There were no heat signatures between the plane and the booth, except for some deer in the tree line, a quarter mile away. I checked the exterior cameras. There are 4 of them on the booth, 1 mounted at each corner, with overlapping coverage of every approach. The image showed the booth's exterior, lit by the floodlights, with nothing in front of the door. Nothing on either side. Nothing anywhere within 50 meters. The knocking continued. 3 knocks. Pause. 3 knocks. 3 knocks. It went on for 4 minutes, I counted, because the binder told me to. I logged the time, the duration, the cadence, the perceived origin point. I did not acknowledge it verbally. I did not acknowledge it physically. I sat at the desk with my hands flat on the surface, and I breathed slowly, and I watched the cameras showing the empty space outside the door. At 2:51, the knocking stopped. The plane left at 3:03, on schedule. I did the post-event walk. I found nothing on the tarmac that night. No artifact, no physical trace. I called Marion on Monday and reported the knock. She didn't say noted. She said something different. She said, "Which door?" I said, "There is only one door." There was a long silence on the line. Then Marion said, "Continue observation. We'll review the recordings on our end. Do not unseal the booth during the event window for any reason." She hung up. I sat in my truck for a long time after that call. I thought about her question, which door? I went back through the binder that night in my apartment, and I read every page, and I found no reference to a second door anywhere. Then on Wednesday, when Lewis came to do maintenance, I asked him about it. He looked at me, and he looked at the floor of the booth, and he said, very quietly, "There is a hatch. Under the equipment panel, you are not supposed to know about it." I waited 3 days. I told myself I was being patient, but really I was being scared. I knew that the moment I opened that hatch, I was going to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. I knew that whatever was down there, Tig had spent decades making sure no contractor would ever see it. I went back on a Tuesday. I told myself it was a routine equipment check, in case anyone reviewed the access logs later. I drove out to Alfred in the early afternoon, signed in at the gate, walked the perimeter for show, and entered the booth at 4:12 p.m. I locked the door behind me. The equipment panel Lewis had described was on the south wall behind the desk, a riveted steel plate roughly 4 feet square. It was bolted in place with 12 hex screws. I had a hex driver in the booth's toolkit. It took me 11 minutes to remove every screw and lift the panel off the wall. Behind the panel was a hatch. It was set into the floor, not the wall. I'd misunderstood Lewis. The panel had concealed the wall recess that gave access to the hatch's bolt-down ring. The hatch itself was circular, maybe 30 inches in diameter, with a recessed handle and a manual locking wheel. It was old. The metal was dull and slightly pitted, the kind of patina you see on industrial fittings that have been undisturbed for 50 years. The TIG security seals on the rim were dated 2019. I broke the seals. I turned the wheel. The hatch lifted with a soft hiss of equalizing air, and I was looking down into a narrow concrete shaft with a steel ladder bolted to one wall. The shaft descended about 15 feet. At the bottom, a horizontal corridor ran roughly toward the terminal building, based on my orientation. The corridor was concrete, original construction, with conduit running along the ceiling and a string of caged incandescent bulbs that flickered to life when I stepped onto the floor. The light switch was a Bakelite toggle from somewhere around 1962. I walked the corridor for approximately 100 yards. I came to a steel door, unlocked, slightly ajar. Beyond the door was a small room, maybe 12 feet by 15, containing 6 olive green filing cabinets, a metal desk, an ashtray full of cigarette ash that had been there long enough to be hardened into a single solid disc, and a wall-mounted reel-to-reel tape recorder with a microphone arm clamped to the desktop. The filing cabinets were labeled, in faded paper tags slipped into brass tag holders, with a single name Hargrove. I should have backed out. I should have resealed the hatch. I should have told Marion the next morning that I'd noticed the panel was loose and tightened it. Instead, I opened the top drawer of the first cabinet. The files were organized chronologically, in manila folders with handwritten labels in a tight, angular script. The earliest folder was dated September 1968. The latest was dated November 1976. Dr. Edwin Hargrove was a physicist. The files made that clear within the first 3 pages. He'd been a contractor for the Department of Defense's Advanced Research Projects Agency, attached to a small atmospheric research program that had been operating, very quietly, out of a converted office on the second floor of Alfred's terminal building from 1968 onward. The program was classified. Its formal designation was Aerial Anomaly Observation Program. Alabama Ford Station. The internal nickname, scrawled in Hargrove's own hand on several memos, was The Watch. Hargrove had been studying electromagnetic phenomena over runway 7. His earliest reports described a recurring anomaly, a region of airspace, roughly 200 meters in diameter, centered at an altitude of approximately 15,000 feet, in which standard electromagnetic measurements behaved incorrectly. Compass needles drifted. Radio signals attenuated and then briefly inverted. Photographic film exposed inside the region developed with unexplained bands of light that did not correspond to any external light source. Hargrove had a name for it. He called it an aperture. His theory, developed over 4 years of observation and several hundred pages of notes, was that the aperture was a thin spot in something. He didn't have the language for it. He was a 1968 physicist working with 1968 instruments. But he wrote, in one memo dated 1970, that he believed the aperture was a boundary condition between two adjacent spatial frames, a place where one set of physical rules ended and another began. He had been recommending in increasingly strong language that Alfred be closed to civilian traffic and the airspace over the airport be permanently restricted. His recommendations had been ignored. Alfred was a regional civilian airfield. The FAA was not going to shut it down based on a classified physicist's worries about anomalous compass readings. On the 12th of March, 1971, Pan American Regional Flight 914 had taken off from Newark on a routing that took it directly through the Alfred aperture at 15,000 feet. It hadn't crashed. It hadn't exploded. It had flown into the aperture and not come out the other side. That was Hargrove's conclusion, written in a memo 3 weeks after the disappearance, in the kind of handwriting that suggests a man who has not slept for a long time. The flight had not been lost. The flight had simply moved into a region from which it had not yet returned. But Hargrove's later files were worse, because he didn't just document the aperture. He documented what came back through it. The second cabinet drawer began in mid-1971 and ran through 1974. The files were labeled with an event numbering system: arrival event 001, arrival event 002, and so on. By the end of 1973, Hargrove had logged 97 arrival events. The first arrival was on May 7, 1971. Approximately 8 weeks after the disappearance, Hargrove had been at the airport that night, running scheduled instrumentation. He had heard the engines. He had watched, from the second-story window of the terminal building, as Flight 914, visually identical to the missing aircraft, descended from a clear sky and landed on runway 7. The plane had sat on the runway for 43 minutes. The cabin lights had been on. The passengers had been visible through the windows. None of them had moved. Then the plane had taken off and disappeared into the sky. Hargrove's first report described the passengers as perfectly still mannequin-like figures. His word, not mine. He had used the optics available to him in 1971, a much cruder set of binoculars than what I had, and he had observed 47 figures motionless in the configuration the original manifest would have suggested. His next report, 2 weeks later, described the second arrival. Same plane, same time, 47 figures, still motionless, but Hargrove noted, and this is in his handwriting, underlined twice, that one figure's posture had shifted between the first event and the second. By event 015 in early 1972, Hargrove was no longer calling them passengers. He was calling them the templates. His theory, developed over the next 2 years and written in increasingly cramped, increasingly desperate notes, was that whatever was inside the aircraft was not the original passengers. The original passengers, in Hargrove's view, were gone, consumed, transformed, destroyed, or stranded. He didn't know. Something else had come back in their place. Something that had access to the shape of the original passengers but not their substance. Something that was very slowly learning how to be them. He wrote, In a 1973 memo, it is using them the way a child uses a costume. The fit is poor at first. With each iteration, the fit improves. He wrote in his last legible memo, dated October 1976, "I do not believe what is on board the aircraft is alive in any sense we currently recognize. I also do not believe it is dead. I believe it is practicing." Hargrove's files ended in November 1976. The last folder contained a single sheet of paper, a typed Department of Defense administrative notice, transferring the program to inactive status and Dr. Hargrove to a different posting. He had died, according to a brief obituary I later found, in 1979, of a heart attack. He had been 51. The last file in the cabinet wasn't written by Hargrove. It was a memo from someone at TIG. Dated 2019, it referenced Hargrove's research, and it used a word he never used: harvest. The TIG memo was 3 pages. It was on letterhead. It was addressed to Marion Caldwell, Director of Site Operations, Alfred Facility. It was signed by someone whose name was redacted in black marker before the file had been placed in the cabinet. But the title was visible: Director, Threshold Assets Division. The memo was a project status update. It described the Alfred site as Asset Site 3, implying the existence of at least 2 others. It summarized the historical Hargrove research as background. Then, on page 2, it laid out what TIG was actually doing. TIG was not containing the aperture. The aperture, it noted, was self-regulating and non-expansive. TIG was not protecting the aircraft or the public from each other. TIG was running a study. The subject of the study was the rate of adaptation. The memo described the entities. They used the term entities directly, which was the first time I'd seen the word in any official document, as high-fidelity human mimics in a slow-progress maturation arc. It described their behavior as increasingly accurate per iteration. It noted that the rate of fidelity improvement had accelerated significantly since 2009, when consistent observer presence was re-established at the booth. The entities required an observer. That was on the second page, in a sentence I read 4 times. The adaptation was driven by proximity to a human consciousness. Without a regular observer, the entities stagnated. With a regular observer, they progressed. That was the job. That was what I had been hired to do. I wasn't a guard. I was a power source. The 3rd page was the worst. The 3rd page laid out what TIG called the viability threshold. It defined a set of criteria, behavioral, physiological, and social, that the entities would need to meet in order to be considered deployment ready. It described what deployment would mean: the placement of high-fidelity entities into civilian roles, with full identity infrastructure, for purposes that the memo did not specify and that I suspect were redacted from the version I was reading. The memo estimated, based on the current rate of progression, that the lead entity, designated 14C, was within 18 to 30 months of viability. It was addressed to Marion Caldwell. She had read this memo. She had filed this memo. She had hired me knowing what the memo said. I put the files back in the order I'd found them. I closed the drawers. I climbed the ladder. I resealed the hatch with the broken seals taped roughly back into place. I bolted the equipment panel back over the wall. I wiped down everything I'd touched. I went home and sat in my truck in the parking lot of my apartment building for 2 hours, watching the streetlights. I tried to think of a single person I could tell. There wasn't one. Then I did something stupid. I went back to work on Friday. I needed to see them differently now. I needed to look at 14C with a knowledge of what she was and what she was being raised to become. Week 9 came in cold. The first true autumn night of the year, frost on the grass at the perimeter, the booth's HVAC working harder than usual to keep the interior at 70. I arrived early. I ran the perimeter twice. I checked every camera, every microphone, every sensor. I sat at the desk with the binder closed in front of me, and I tried to slow my heart rate. Knowing what I knew now changed everything about how I watched. Before the Hargrove files, the entities had been a phenomenon. Frightening, impossible, but distant. Something that occurred in front of me, the way weather occurred. After the files, they were participants. They were trying. They were students in a 55-year apprenticeship, and I was the textbook. The plane landed at 2:17. Same approach. Same flare. Same precise rollout to the same stopping point. The cabin lights came on with their usual warm amber glow. I trained the optics on the windows. The passengers were more animated than they had ever been. I want to be careful with that word. They weren't moving the way living people move. The motion was still wrong, too smooth in some places, too jerky in others, with small pauses that came at the wrong intervals. But they were moving. A man in row 4 was tapping his fingers on the armrest in a pattern that almost looked like a habitual nervous tic. A woman in row 9 was turning the pages of a magazine. A boy of about 10 in row 17, who I had never seen move at all in any prior week, was looking out the window at the dark. He turned his head slowly from the window to the seat back in front of him and back again, the way a bored child does on a long flight. The flight crew was animated too. Through the cockpit windows, I could see Captain Ennis adjusting something on the overhead panel. The first officer was writing on a clipboard. In seat 14C, the figure was no longer sitting. She was standing in the aisle next to her seat. She was facing the window, facing the booth, facing me. Her hands were folded in front of her, the way a teacher stands when she is waiting for a class to settle down. Her head was tilted very slightly to the right, an inquisitive angle, almost friendly. I held the optics on her. She lifted her right hand. She placed it against the inside of the cabin window, palm flat against the glass. And then she mouthed a word. I read lips. It is not a skill I trained for, exactly, but 18 years of legitimate security work in environments where you can see people through glass and not hear them gives you a working ability. You learn to recognize the shapes of common words. Help. Stop. Please. Wait. The basic vocabulary of someone trying to communicate without sound. She didn't mouth any of those words. She mouthed Dominic. 3 syllables. The mouth opening on the long O of the first syllable, the lips coming together for the M, the tongue rising for the N, the final syllable opening again into the soft K. I read it twice. I read it 3 times. She mouthed it slowly, deliberately, the way you mouth a word for someone you want to make sure understands you. Then she stopped. She lowered her hand. She kept watching me. I dropped the optics. I want to be honest about the next several seconds because they matter. I sat down on the floor of the booth. I did not remember sitting down. My back was against the desk and my knees were pulled up to my chest, and my hands were shaking hard enough that I could hear them shaking, the soft slap of palm against denim. I tried to take a breath. The breath came out as a sound I didn't recognize as my own. I told myself I had read it wrong. I told myself the lighting was bad. The optics were imperfect. The human face is full of ambiguous shapes. I told myself a dozen things. Then I remembered the cameras. I crawled across the floor to the recording station. I pulled up the high-resolution feed from camera 2, which had a direct line of sight on the cabin windows. I scrubbed back to the moment. I zoomed in on her face. I played it at quarter speed. She mouthed my name. There was no ambiguity. The cameras captured it perfectly. The shape of the word, the rhythm of the syllables, the small forward push of her lips on the final consonant. Dominique. I played it again. I played it at half speed, with the audio enhancement turned up to maximum, just in case some breath of sound had carried through the glass that the cabin windows shouldn't have let pass. There was nothing audible, but the lips were unmistakable. I sat on the floor of the booth for the remaining 14 minutes of the event window. I didn't look through the optics again. I let the cameras record. At 3 a.m. the cabin lights went dark. At 3:03 the plane took off. I did the post-event walk because the binder said to. I didn't find any artifacts on the tarmac that night. I filed the report. I drove home with the windows down because the truck smelled like gardenias and I couldn't stand it. I called Lewis at 4:17 a.m. I told him what had happened. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "It happened to the third contractor too." That is when he started answering the knocks. We met at a diner 40 miles from Alford on Saturday morning. Lewis chose the place. It was the kind of diner that has been in business since 1962 and has the same coffee mugs it had in 1962. We sat in a booth in the back. Lewis ordered eggs. He didn't eat them. He told me about Garrett Sable. Garrett had been hired in early 2023. He'd been a former Army SID investigator, divorced. No children, the kind of profile Tig seemed to prefer. He'd been at Alford for almost a year before the targeting started. The first sign had been in his 8th month, when an entity in row 6, a woman in a navy dress, originally listed on the manifest as a passenger named Constance Webb, had begun gesturing in a way that mirrored, very specifically, a hand gesture Garrett used, a small twirling motion he made with his right index finger when he was thinking. An idiosyncratic tic. The entity had begun making the same gesture in her seat for several minutes during the event window. Garrett had reported it. Marion had said, noted. In month 10, the entity had begun mouthing his name. It was always Constance, never any of the others. She would look at the booth and mouth Garrett once, then sit down, then look up again 10 minutes later and do it again. In month 11, the entity had begun displaying what Lewis described as memory references. Postures Garrett held when he was tired. The way he tilted his head when he was listening. Once, in week 47, she had been holding a magazine open to a specific page, and Garrett had recognized through the optics that the page contained an article he had read in a copy of Atlantic the previous week, in his apartment alone. Garrett had become convinced, by month 12, that the entity was trying to communicate, that she was a victim, that she was reaching out across an unimaginable distance to a familiar consciousness, and that the right response, the human response, was to meet her halfway. In week 51 of his contract, on a Friday in late February 2024, Garrett opened the booth door during the event window. He walked across the tarmac toward the aircraft. The booth's external cameras recorded the entire event. Lewis had seen the footage. He described it to me. Garrett walked at a normal pace. He did not appear distressed. He approached the aircraft from the rear, walked around to the front, and stood at the foot of where the cabin door would have opened. The cabin door opened. There was no slide. There was a set of folding stairs of the kind that DC-8s used in 1971 that had not been visible before. Garrett walked up the stairs. He stepped inside. The door closed behind him. The plane took off at 3:03 on schedule. I asked Lewis if Garrett had ever come back. Lewis stirred his coffee, he said. The next Friday there were 43 passengers. There have been 43 ever since. So I called Marion that afternoon from a payphone outside a gas station in Staunton. I'd looked up where the nearest payphones still existed. There are surprisingly few of them, because I didn't trust my cell, and I didn't trust the booth's hardline, and I needed to have a conversation that wasn't going to be filed in any TIG database I could imagine. She answered on the second ring. She always answered on the second ring. I said, I read the Hargrove files. There was a pause of about 3 seconds. Then Marion said, in the same calm professional voice she always used, I see. I said, I know about the Harvest memo. I know what TIG is doing. I know about Garrett Sable. I know I am bait, Marion said. You are not bait, Mr. Reeves. Bait implies passive use. You are an instrument. There is a difference. I told her I was going to quit. I told her I didn't care about paragraph 14 subsection C. I told her she could send people after me. I'd already left documentation in places she wouldn't find. Marion said, We selected you, Mr. Reeves, because your psychological profile indicated you would observe rather than engage. Your SID-administered MMPI subscores showed strong rule adherence, weak boundary transgression, high object task fixation, low social risk-taking. You were never going to be a Garrett. You were going to be steady, and you have been steady for 9 weeks exactly as we projected. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said, We want you to keep observing. That is all we have ever wanted. The work is the observation. The entities adapt because someone is watching them. You are the consciousness against which they refine themselves. There is no harm in this work, Mr. Reeves. Nothing has been done to you that you have not been compensated for. I said something then that I am not proud of. I said, "What if I tell people?" Marion said, "Tell whom?" She wasn't being cruel. She was just asking the question, and I didn't have an answer. She said, "If your psychological profile has shifted, we have a contingency. You will not enjoy the contingency. Continue observation. Do not deviate from protocol. Good night, Mr. Reeves." She hung up. I stood in the gas station parking lot with the receiver in my hand for a long time. I should have driven away. The contract was paper. The contingency was a threat. I could have run. But I went home, and I sat with the booth's recording from week 9 on my laptop, and I played the slowed-down audio enhancement of the moment 14C had mouthed my name. The speech recognition algorithm I'd run the night before had pulled, very faintly, what it parsed as a second word. I dismissed it as artifact noise. Now I played it again, with the gain pushed higher. After she said Dominic, she had said something else. 3 words. "Your daughter misses you." I spent the next 2 weeks preparing. I told myself I was preparing in the rational sense, reinforcing the booth, reviewing the protocols, building contingencies. And I was. I added a secondary lock to the booth door. A simple deadbolt I installed on a Wednesday while Lewis pretended not to notice. I bought a hunting knife and a flashlight with a striking bezel and stored them under the desk. I memorized the protocol 12 emergency beacon procedure until I could activate it in the dark with my eyes closed. But I was also preparing in another sense, and I knew it. I was getting ready to break Rule 3, or Rule 12, or Rule 14. I didn't know which one yet. I just knew that my last conversation with Marion had ended my ability to pretend I was still on Tig's side. I also did something I shouldn't have. I drove to Charlottesville on the Tuesday of week 12. I sat in my truck across the street from the elementary school where my daughter Lily attended 3rd grade. I watched her come out at 3:15 holding her backpack with both hands, talking to a friend whose name I didn't know. She was wearing the green dress with the white collar that her mother had bought her for school pictures. The same dress that was in the photograph clipped to my truck's dashboard. I didn't approach her. I didn't even get out of the truck. The court order was specific. I just watched her get into the carpool line and disappear into someone else's minivan. I had brought the photograph into the booth with me every Friday for 11 weeks. I had set it on the desk where I could see it. I had told myself it kept me grounded. The binder said no personal photographs, no identifying documents, no personal electronics. I had broken Rule 911 times. Friday week 12 came in cold and clear. I started Friday protocol at 2 a.m. I was in the booth by 2:08. I activated the recording equipment by 2011. I checked the analog clock. I sat down. I waited. At 2:14, the temperature dropped 11 degrees in 90 seconds. At 2:15, I heard the engines. The plane descended on schedule, banked, lined up with runway 7, flared, kissed the tarmac, rolled out, and stopped at the usual point. But the cabin lights didn't come on. I waited 30 seconds. A minute, 2 minutes. The cabin remained dark. I switched the optics to thermal. The aircraft showed thermal residual from the engines, but no internal heat signatures inside the cabin. No glowing window outlines. No warm seats. Nothing. Then at 2:19, the engines shut down completely. I had never seen them shut down before. The low hum that always persisted, that low chest vibration of the air around the plane, was gone. The runway was completely silent. For about 30 seconds, nothing else happened. Then the forward cabin door opened, and the emergency slide deployed. I want to describe what I saw on the cameras because I couldn't bring myself to look at it through the optics. The optics felt too close. The slide inflated normally. It hit the tarmac with a soft thump I could just barely hear through the booth's armored glass. The forward cabin door stood open, a dark rectangle in the side of the aircraft. And after a pause of perhaps 10 seconds, the first figure descended. He came down the slide feet first, the way you are supposed to. He was wearing a dark suit, narrow lapels, a thin tie, 1971 business attire. His hat fell off as he slid. It came to rest on the tarmac next to him. He stood up. He retrieved the hat. He put it back on. He walked, stiffly, 6 paces away from the slide, and he stopped. The next figure descended, A woman in a green knee-length dress and a string of pearls. She slid down, stood up, walked her own 6 paces in a different direction, and stopped. They came out one at a time. The infrared camera showed me what visible light didn't. Their heat signatures were wrong. A normal human body shows heat distributed across the entire torso, the core organs, the blood vessels, the skin surface. These figures showed heat only in the head and the hands. Their torsos were dark, cold. There was nothing inside them generating warmth. Just the heads and the hands, glowing softly in the infrared, like puppets where someone had inserted heating elements, only in the parts that needed to look human. I counted them as they descended. 1, 5, 10, 20, 30. 43 figures came down the slide. 43. Not 42, not 47, 43. The flight crew did not exit, only the passengers, and one of them was Garrett. I scanned the figures with the optics, finally looking for him. I found him third from the rear. He was wearing 1971 clothing, a brown corduroy jacket, a turtleneck, but the face was Garrett's face. I'd seen his ID photo in Lewis's tablet. The features were unmistakable. He stood the way Garrett had presumably stood. He didn't move. The 43 of them stood in a loose arc on the tarmac, all of them facing the terminal building, not the booth. The terminal, which was 300 meters away on the other side of the runway, boarded up and dark. They stood like an audience waiting for a curtain to rise. Except one. Seat 14C. The woman in the navy dress, the Margaret Hollowell shape, turned 90 degrees away from the terminal. She turned to face the booth. She started walking toward me. She covered the 80 meters slowly. Her gait was the most human I had ever seen from any of them. A normal walking pace, normal arm swing, normal weight transfer from heel to toe. If I hadn't known what she was, I would have thought a woman in 1971 clothing was simply walking across an airport tarmac on a cold autumn night. I activated the Protocol 12 emergency beacon at 30 meters out. The system showed green. Signal sent. Signal acknowledged. I waited for any response. The radio in the booth stayed silent. The cell phone Marion had given me showed full signal, but no incoming call. No text. Nothing. I activated again at 20 meters. Green. Nothing. At 10 meters, I realized no one was coming. She reached the booth. She stopped about a foot from the door. She turned slowly and looked at the armored glass window to the left of the door, the window I was sitting next to. She walked to the window. She placed her right hand against the glass. I was perhaps 6 inches from her hand. The armored glass was 4 inches thick. I could see every detail of her palm, the lines, the small wrinkles around the knuckles, the chipped polish on the 3rd fingernail. The glass frosted around her hand, not from cold, from something else. The frost spread in a pattern that didn't look like ice. It looked like the way frost forms on a window in a dream, in patterns that suggest words you can't quite read. Her face was about a foot from mine. I could see her eyes for the first time. They were brown. They were wet. They looked exactly like the eyes of a 34-year-old woman who had been a schoolteacher in Baltimore in 1971 and who was trying very hard, in this moment, to be understood. She spoke. The sound came through the glass clearly, as though the glass weren't there. She said, "You read the files." I didn't answer. Rule 5. Rule 14. I held onto the rules with both hands. She said, "You know what they want us for. You know what we're being made into." I held my breath. She said, "Help us, Dominic. Help us stay. Help us be real. We're so close. We're so close to being people. Don't let them harvest us. Don't let them put us into the world the way they want to. Help us be us." And God help me, she sounded like she meant it. She sounded like a frightened woman asking for help. I felt, and I have to be honest about this, because the honesty is the warning. I felt a flicker of something like sympathy, a tiny, terrible, instinctive want to help. That flicker was the same flicker Garrett had felt. I knew it the moment I felt it. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to taste blood, and I held on, and I didn't move, and I didn't speak. She watched me through the glass for perhaps 30 seconds. Then she lowered her hand. The frost stayed where it was. She turned. She walked back across the tarmac slowly the way she had come. She walked backward up the slide. They all did. 43 figures going up an emergency slide in reverse, smoothly, without effort, as though the slide ran both ways for them. The cabin door closed behind the last of them. The engines spooled up. At 3:03, Flight 914 took off. I sat on the floor of the booth for a long time after the plane left. My nose was bleeding. I hadn't noticed it during the encounter. There was a dark stain on the front of my jacket and a wet streak from my upper lip to my chin. I wiped it with the back of my hand. I tasted copper and something faintly floral, and I realized with a slow horror that didn't feel like horror so much as a tired confirmation, that the gardenia smell was inside me now. It was on my breath. It was in the blood from my nose. The booth interior smelled like an aviation hangar and a funeral home. I checked the analog clock, 3:04. I checked the outside cameras. The runway was empty except for the maintained lights and a small dark shape near the touchdown point that I could not yet identify. I filed the report. I used the encrypted tablet. I described the breach, the egress, the approach, the communication attempt, the return. I did not describe the things 14C had said in detail. I wrote that entity 14C made a verbal solicitation in the direction of the observation booth. No response was issued. Marion responded within 3 minutes. The response was 4 words. Inspect tarmac. Bring artifacts. I sat for another minute with the tablet in my hand. Looking at the 4 words, there was no acknowledgement of the breach, no expression of concern, no instruction about my own safety. The Protocol 12 beacon I had activated 3 times had received no response because no response had ever been planned. The beacon was a comfort feature for the contractor. It connected to nothing. I went out with a flashlight and a plastic evidence bag. The runway was cold and quiet. The maintained lights hummed faintly. I walked the 400 meters with the beam swinging in front of me, looking for the dark shape I had seen on the cameras. There were no tire marks tonight. The plane had left no trace where the wheels had touched. The slide was gone. The 43 figures had left no footprints, although the tarmac had a fine dusting of frost from the temperature drop and any normal human passage would have shown. About midway down the strip, I found a single piece of paper. It was lying flat on the tarmac, weighted by nothing, undisturbed by the wind. A boarding pass. I crouched and looked at it before I picked it up. I had learned that lesson. It was Pan American. Same flight number, 914. Same date, the 12th of March, 1971. Same paper stock, same hand-stamped seat number, same faded ink. But the seat assignment was new. Seat 23AI had reviewed the original 1971 manifest in detail. Row 23 had been the last passenger row, and on the left side of the aisle, only seat 23B had been occupied by a man named Howard Pierce, returning from a business trip. Seat 23A had been empty. It had been empty on every landing I had observed for 12 weeks. It had been empty in Hargrove's records, going back to 1971. It had been empty for 55 years. The name on the boarding pass was Garrett Sable. I sat down on the tarmac. I sat down because my legs stopped holding me up. The cold of the asphalt came up through my pants and I noticed it without minding it. I held the boarding pass with both hands in my gloves, and I looked at the name in the faded 1971 typeface, on a ticket dated the 12th of March, 1971, for a man who had not been born until 1979. The entities did not kill. The entities incorporated. They had taken Garrett on a night in February 2024, and they had not destroyed him. They had reissued him. He was a passenger now. He had a seat. He had a 1971 boarding pass with his name printed on it, as though he had always been on the manifest, as though the manifest had simply been waiting for him to arrive. I turned the boarding pass over. There was handwriting on the back. Pencil faint in a hand I almost recognized. I had seen Garrett's handwriting in the tablet's old contractor logs, and this was close. This was very close, but slightly different. The way your own handwriting looks slightly different when you've been very tired or very sick. 4 words, don't open the door. I bagged the pass. I bagged Margaret's pass with it, the one I had kept all these weeks in the booth's evidence locker. 2 boarding passes from 1971, one for a woman who had vanished, one for a man who had walked. I sealed the bag, then I stood up, and I walked back to the booth, and I noticed something on the recording I had missed. I pulled up the booth's external camera footage from the moment of the egress. I watched the figures come down the slide. I counted them again. 43. I had counted 43 in real time, and the cameras confirmed 43. That was what I had reported to Marion, but something at the edge of the frame caught my eye on the 3rd replay. I scrolled to the moment after the last figure had cleared the slide and joined the loose arc on the tarmac. I paused the frame. I zoomed in on the slide. There was a 44th figure. She was standing at the foot of the slide, partially obscured by the tail of the slide itself, in a position that the wide-angle lens had distorted enough to make her almost invisible at normal playback speed. She was small. She was much smaller than the others. I zoomed in further. The image pixelated, then resolved as the algorithm sharpened. A child, a girl maybe 8 years old. She had brown hair, cut to her shoulders with bangs slightly too long, the way Lily wore hers because she hated getting trims. She was wearing a green dress with a white collar. She was holding a small object in her hands, too small to identify clearly, but it looked like a folded piece of paper, the way a child holds a note from her teacher. She was not on any 1971 manifest. There had been no children on Flight 914. The youngest passenger had been 17. She did not belong on that plane in that decade, in that arc of figures on the tarmac. She belonged on a dashboard in a 2014 Ford F-150, clipped to the rearview mirror with a bent paper clip, in a 3rd-grade school photograph from October 2024. I had brought the photograph to work every Friday for 12 weeks. I had set it on the desk where I could see it. I had told myself it kept me grounded. The entities had been watching the booth the entire time. They had not just learned my name, they had learned my face. They had learned my voice. They had learned the way I stood, and the way I moved my hands, and the way I drank my coffee, and the way I looked. Every Friday at a green dress photograph clipped to a dashboard that was parked 20 meters from the booth, visible through the windshield, illuminated by the maintained runway lights. They had learned what I loved, and they had built it. Passenger 44 was not on the manifest. Passenger 44 was not from 1971. Passenger 44 was from my truck. I am recording this on a Tuesday because by Friday it might be too late. I haven't quit. I am not going to quit. I want you to understand why, because if you followed me this far, you deserve to understand the choice. It isn't the contract. Marion would enforce the contract. I have no doubt of that. There is a contingency, and the contingency is real, and I would not enjoy it. But the contract isn't what is keeping me here. The contract is paper. My daughter's face is on that plane. If Tig is correct, and the entities are approaching a viability threshold, if they are months away from being convincing enough to walk into a school office and pick a child up at 3:15 in a green dress with a white collar, then the version of Lily that is currently on board Flight 914 will get better at being her with every Friday, with every observation, with every minute I spend sitting in a booth 80 meters away looking at her through armored glass, teaching her by being her father near her. If I leave, she stagnates. The Margaret entity told me, in her way, what they need. They need the observer. Without me, the small one in the green dress stops growing. She stays as she is, close to my daughter, but not close enough, not yet a viable replacement. But if I stay, she continues, she gets better, she gets closer, and eventually she is good enough that Tig can deploy her. Eventually, my real daughter is at recess in Charlottesville, and somebody who looks exactly like her, who knows my voice and my hands and my face, walks into her life. I cannot let either of those things happen. I cannot leave. I cannot stay in the booth and let her grow. So this Friday I am not staying in the booth. I have spent the last 4 days planning what I am going to do. I have the hunting knife. I have the flashlight with the striking bezel. I have the booth's master key, which opens the equipment locker where the Protocol 12 beacon is housed, and inside that locker is a flare gun that the binder describes as a signaling device, but which, at close range against a fuel tank, is something else. I don't know if any of it will work. I don't know if you can kill something that has been practicing being human for 55 years. I don't know if I'll come back from the runway, or if next Friday Louis Tran will arrive at noon on Wednesday and find an empty booth and a bagged set of recordings and one more boarding pass on the tarmac with my name on it. But Garrett left me 4 words on the back of his ticket, and I am going to take them with me as instructions, even if I have to break them to follow them. If something goes wrong, this recording is in the hands of someone I trust to keep it. They have instructions. They know what to do. They know the names. Marion Caldwell, Threshold Infrastructure Group, Alford Regional Airfield, Hargrove The Aperture, The Harvest, Asset Site 3, which means there are at least 2 others. My daughter's name is Lily Reeves. She is 8 years old. She lives with her mother in Charlottesville. She is a real, living child. If you ever meet a girl who looks like her, who acts like her, who answers to her name and something about her is not quite right, you will know what she is. You will know who put her there. Flight 914 lands every Friday at 2:17 a.m. This Friday, I am not staying in the booth.